Hi everyone, welcome on my channel. I'm so happy you're here. My name is Marianne and on this channel I post about geopolitics and political developments from around the world. And today I want to talk about how Vladimir Putin rebuilt an authoritarian, anti-Western and quasi-imperial Russian state from the ruins of the Soviet collapse, using centralized power, nationalism, energy leverage, military interventions, and historical revisionism to reassert Russia as a great power and justify the war in Ukraine. Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin was born on October 7, 1952 in Leningrad in Russia, at the time USSR, and he's now age 73. He was trained as a KGB officer and stationed in Dresden in East Germany when the wall fell. And so he saw firsthand how the Soviets retreated from East Germany and the system that he devoted his life to collapsed in front of him. The collapse of the Soviet Union was lived as a humiliation for Vladimir Putin. He later rose under President Boris Yeltsin, first as a spy chief and then as a prime minister. He presented himself as the antidote to the chaos that appeared at the fall of the USSR. His image was that of a disciplined, loyal, and decisive politician. And to Russia's exhausted elite, that was exactly what they needed. Someone who could stop the bleeding, restore control, and bring back a sense of national pride. But Putin never forgot the fall of the USSR, and already in 2005, he said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. So Putin's first mission when he became president in 2000 was to reining the oligarch that profited from the 1990s and force them to pledge loyalty to him or face exile and prison. Independent channels were taken over by the state and regional governors lost their autonomy. And step by step, every institution came to report to the Kremlin. And Putin called it the vertical of power. It wasn't really a return to the Soviet communism, but it was a rejection of Western liberal democracy. Putin described it more as sovereign democracy, a democracy that served the state, not the other way around. And that is already a very authoritarian mindset. Democracies are built on the principle that the state is accountable to its citizens and not that citizens serve an abstract state. Over the year, the system hardened. The ruling party, United Russia, became the political arm of the Kremlin, and opposition figures were harassed, shut down, imprisoned, or killed. Laws were introduced to control NGOs and brand those who received foreign funding as foreign agents. Internet censorship expanded and online platforms were brought under state oversight. The Duma passed vague extremist and dissident laws that were used to silence dissidents. He also reanchored Russia's identity in nationalism and religion. The church, which was sidelined during the Soviet era, came back to the forefront, and we saw priests bless missiles. The history textbooks were rewritten, and they were praising strong rulers. His message was clear: Russia's strength comes from unity and faith, not from Western individualism. Meanwhile, energy became his ultimate tool of power. Gazprom and Rosneft, one semi-independent giants, became arms of the state energy in the 2000s. Oil and gas money built Moscow's skyline and paid for loyalty at home, while Europe's dependence on Russian energy gave Putin leverage abroad. In 2020, Putin obtained the change of the constitution to reset his term limits, allowing him to potentially stay in power until 2036, and he will then be 84 years old. But to many Russians, the 2000s felt like redemption. Stability, rising incomes, pride returning, etc. But beneath this stability was the steady erosion of freedom. Putin's logic was simple: without a strong state, there would be chaos. But because of this, it transformed Russia from a shaky post-Soviet democracy into an illiberal system. On the foreign affairs side, Putin was not always openly against the West. In fact, at the start of his presidency, Putin was not confrontational towards the West. After 9/11, he was the first world leader to call George Bush to offer cooperation against terrorism and partnership. But the movements that overthrew authoritarian governments in Georgia in 2003, in Ukraine in 2004, and Kyrgyzstan in 2005 led Putin to believe that the US and the EU were promoting regime change near Russia. And in the 2007 Munich Security Conference, Putin accused the US of overstepping its border in every way and undermining international law. And there he was clearly framing the West as a threat to Russia. Just to be clear, I'm using the West as an item. Obviously, there are differences of policies between different countries in the West, but it is true that they are aligned more or less in many policies, especially similar positions on many different subjects. But so as NATO expanded eastward, the old fear returned. Russia being encircled, betrayed, and pushed from its historical sphere. Putin believes that the West wants to keep Russia weak, divided, and dependent. In his view, the West is reproducing what they did during the Cold War, which is incitement and containment. And this is happening against the backdrop of great power competition, where Russia is losing its relative place. And it is true that these strategies have been used during the Cold War to isolate and contain rival countries through military, political, and economic alliances. So there's a fundamental divergence in vision here, where Western politicians and analysts see citizens demanding democracy. Putin sees a CIA engineer coup and interference on Russia's doorstep. And from then on, his conviction hardened. Democracy promotion was just another weapon. The West doesn't spread freedom, it spreads instability and wants to dominate. And so coming back to the 2007 Munich conference, he accused the leaders of NATO of betraying their promise that NATO would not expand eastward and had deceived Russia. And this is an accusation that has gone back ever since. But there are two issues with this accusation. First of all, it was a limited comment during negotiations on the reunification of Germany, which actually did not bring any agreement afterwards, but is now interpreted as a general commitment to not integrate any Eastern or Central European countries, which is not in the scope of what was talked about at that time and was not even agreed at that time. And it also completely denies Central and Eastern European countries' agency. And they have experienced firsthand Russia's imperialism, and they see NATO as the best protection against it. And this denial of their sovereignty and right to choose is part of what they see as Russia's imperialism. Either way, from that point, the wedge built and deepened. And in 2008, when Georgia's pro-Western president sought a NATO membership, Putin was ready to act and send troops across the border. And he justified the invasion as a measure to protect Russian-speaking populations in the breakaway regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. 6 years later, in 2014, after a popular uprising overthrew a pro-Russian leader in Ukraine in favor of democracy and the EU, Putin seized Crimea and sent troops to the Donbass to support the independent movements there. He justified this as protecting Russian speakers, and for many Russians this was personal. It was the restoration of national honor and reclaiming a territory that ought to belong to them. Plus, Russia regained Sebastopol, a strategic base for the Russian fleet in the Black Sea. The annexation was actually widely popular. Putin's approval rate soared to 80% at that time. And then came Syria in 2015. Putin positioned Russia as a major actor in the Middle East by defending Bashar al-Assad, blocking Western plans, and proving that Moscow could shape global outcomes. Russia also saw the expansion of its access to the Syrian port of Tartus after 2015, enhancing its projection capability in the Mediterranean Sea and beyond. So beneath all these moves, there is a fundamental imperial vision. Putin sees Russia as the heir of the Tsarist Empire and the Soviet Union, and he draws on thinkers like Alexander Dugin and the Neo-Eurasian ideology, which is an eclectic mixture of Russian patriotism, Orthodox faith, anti-modernism, and some Bolshevik ideas. It opposes American values such as liberalism, capitalism, and modernism, and views the West as spiritually bankrupt. And he showed this in a speech in 2013, warning that we see how many Euro-Atlantic countries are rejecting their roots, denying moral principles and traditional identities. So he really wants to promote the idea that Russia is fundamentally traditional and embraces traditional values. And a major turn in Putin's governance happened during COVID, when he became more and more isolated and entrenched in his own certitudes. In July 2021, while he was isolating, Putin published a long, widely criticized essay entitled "On the Historical Unity of Russians and Ukrainians" that denies Ukrainian statehood in practical terms and retells history to justify Russia's claim on Ukraine. And after that essay, the Kremlin amplified that narrative on social media, through state media as well, in education and official channels. And this essay in reality is just rewriting history, and it's just a justification to draw back Ukraine into Moscow's orbit, justifying it by a common history and unique people from the ancient Rus, or the Kievan Rus, which was the first Eastern Slavic state with Kiev as its capital, and that spanned from the 19th to the 13th century. But even if this was true, it's such an old claim on Ukraine territory and its people. A lot of frontiers would be redesigned if we followed that logic. But in Putin's view, restoring Russia's greatness would cement his legacy. And so he decided to invade Ukraine, arguing that it was for denazification, which there are probably, there are Nazis in every country, but there are probably more in Russia than Ukraine. And the plan failed. He expected to take Kiev in a few days and for the West to fracture, and instead Ukraine resisted and NATO and the West united, surprising even the United States at that time. This, however, further confirmed to Putin that Russia was the victim of the West, and he said, "Today our armed forces are operating across a front that exceeds 1,000 kilometers, opposing not only neo-Nazi formations, but the new military machine of the collective West," in September 2022. And he reiterated this message in 2023, and I quote, "Russia today is leading the most difficult war for its future, repelling the aggression of neo-Nazi and their handlers. Against us, the whole military, economic, and information machines of the West are turned." So again, he's framing this war not just as an invasion and annexation, but as protection against Nazis and a war against the whole West, which is imposing sanctions and trying to economically and militarily, as well as informationally, destroy Russia. And in this mindset, Putin turned towards the East for support. Already 3 weeks before the invasion, Putin and Xi Jinping proclaimed an unlimited friendship between Russia and China. And after the invasion, Russia became the most sanctioned country in the world, he sought support from anti-Western countries. His hope was to replace the market in the West by exporting to China, for example, India, but this falls short of replacing Western markets because of the lack of infrastructure and sanctions against Moscow that limits its options. And with the strong resistance of Ukraine on the battlefield, supported by Western weaponry and intelligence, Putin continues to be entrenched in his vision that Russia is bullied by the West. And questions are raised about his capacity to have access to accurate information and assess correctly the reality of the battlefield. But for me, the most fascinating part about Vladimir Putin is that he actually said a lot beforehand. Before everything happened, he already promoted the idea that this should happen. And so when people tell you who they are, believe them. Putin laid out his vision for Russia and the world order for 2 decades, and yet a lot of officials and scholars doubted that he would conduct the full invasion of Ukraine back in 2022, despite US intelligence largely released and warning the world about it. The second part is how just one man can have such a huge influence on the lives and livelihood of people. Political institutions in Russia were incapable of stopping his authoritarian ambitions, and he was able to reshape them into a system that protects and serves him and his ambitions. And so that's why it is so important to study and understand leaders just as much as institutions. So I hope this summary can bring you an overview of who he is, how he thinks, and how we came to this situation in Ukraine. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you very soon in another video. Bye!